Hi everyone, and welcome to the Mummy Movie Podcast, where we are looking at the original 1997 Disney comedy film Under Wraps. So this is basically a film about a group of children who find an ancient Egyptian living mummy. Although initially they are scared of it, they quickly realise that it is a nice mummy, and then they have to protect it, and get it back to its coffin before the end of midnight. If they fail, it will turn to dust. In terms of the format for this episode, we shall start with a little look at the historical accuracy of the film. And I should stress, I feel, the idea here is not to mock the film. It is more to use it as a bit of a sort of jumping off point to talk about interesting facts about ancient Egypt. After that, I shall simply review the film and then rate it out of 10. Okay, let's not waste any more time. Let's get to it. To begin with, the film says that living mummies were the guardians of the pharaohs and queens. I mean, it's pretty obvious this is incorrect. Mummies were supposed to help the deceased to survive in the afterlife, but they were never supposed to rise again in this life, as is shown in the film. And also, just in general, pharaohs and queens were also made into mummies, so the whole thing just doesn't really make sense. The film then goes on to say that the living mummy was buried in a coffin known as a sarcophagus. A sarcophagus technically is a type of coffin, but first of all, the mummy in the film isn't in a sarcophagus, it's just in a regular coffin. As explained in previous episodes, a sarcophagus is basically a big box, normally made of stone, in which the coffins are stored. For elite individuals in Egypt, typically you'd have 3 coffins sort of stacked inside one another like Russian dolls, and they'd be stored in the sarcophagus. In the film, the deceased is just in a coffin. The film then goes on to say that the mummy will come back to life at the full moon on Halloween, and if he does not get back to his coffin by the next midnight, he will turn into a pillar of salt and his soul will be lost forever. Well, I mean, Halloween doesn't have ancient Egyptian origins, for a start. It has Celtic origins. However, it is worth noting, I suppose, that the ancient Egyptians did have a lot of festivals, and many of these festivals held similarities with the ones we have today. So, for instance, there was a lot of eating, drinking, and dancing, and things like that. In terms of the time of the year, the closest one to Halloween would be the festival of Anuket, which took place around about October 30th. Anuket was the goddess of the lower cataracts in Egypt, and she had her cult centre in Elephantine, which was quite close to those cataracts. This festival started with the annual flooding of the Nile, and people basically threw sort of jewellery and precious gifts into the Nile as a way of thanking the goddess. In terms of the ancient Egyptian festival that was closest in tone to Halloween, that would probably be the beautiful festival of the Bali, which took place in May at Thebes, and it kind of began at the beginning of the new moon. To begin with, in this festival, the statues of the gods Amun, Khonsu and Mut were taken out of the temple complex of Karnak, and they were carried over to the Theban necropolis where they visited the royal tombs. This procession would last for several days, and also the people of Thebes would offer flowers to their ancestors in their tombs as well. Flowers in ancient Egypt basically symbolised life. And in terms of this festival, they were supposed to help renew the life of the deceased to ensure their survival in the afterlife. During this festival, people would also drink and sleep on top of the tombs of their ancestors. Although all of this sounds quite morbid, it does need to be realised that it was actually supposed to be quite a joyous festival, with the general idea that the deceased weren't necessarily dead as such, they were just living in the next life. Because generally there's sort of this misconception that the ancient Egyptians were obsessed with death, when in reality the opposite's actually true. They were obsessed with life and they loved life and they wanted life to continue after death. Right, moving on. Finally, at one point, they go to a museum in the film. Gilbert, one of the main characters in the film, reads a description about the high priests of Egypt. It basically says that the high priests were the advisors, bodyguards and confidants of the queens of Egypt, and they were sworn to be by their side in this life and the next. This is completely wrong in pretty much every possible way. Maybe with the exception of the pharaoh, the high priests were actually just the most senior position in the various temples across Egypt. And actually, when it comes to the high priest of Amun during the 21st dynasty, it's arguable that he was as powerful as the pharaoh himself, and maybe even greater. Gilbert then goes on to say that the high priests had to remain celibate. No, actually quite a few of the high priests had wives and children, so they definitely weren't celibate. The only position I can think of the top of my head that had to remain celibate would be the god's wife of Amun. For more information on that, listen to the first episode I ever did on the Mummy 1932, because I discuss it more there. I will also say, just generally look up the position as well, especially if you're interested in women in ancient Egypt. Okay, in this final section of the episode, I'm just going to review the film, say what I like and dislike about it, talk about the stuff that I liked for the wrong reasons as well, and generally rate the film. Okay, so we'll start with the good stuff. Firstly, the early vibe of the film was quite nostalgic in a way. It was somewhere between Goosebumps and the original Jumanji. I have a lot of fondness for Goosebumps, and I really love the original Jumanji as well, so that's really good. Actually, Jumanji is one of those really rare cases where the remakes I'm in my personal opinion, are as good as the original. I also really appreciated that all of the characters in this film were quite colourful and unique. So we go over the main three characters. So you have Marshall, Amy and Gilbert. They're all, children. Marshall and Amy, they kind of start off with one-upping themselves in how fearless they are. And it's quite apparent from the beginning that Amy's a little bit selfish, and Marshall, he's got a little bit of anger behind him. Meanwhile, Gilbert is sort of just a coward, and happily so. What's really good about this is that you actually see the characters grow as the film goes on. And okay, it's a little bit cheesy, but we are talking about a Disney Channel film here, so you've got to take that really. So Amy becomes more empathetic and she starts doing things for other people. Marshall, you find out that he's sort of a bit angry because his parents have divorced and his mum's got a new boyfriend. And basically he learns to accept that new boyfriend and he realises that it makes her happy. So I suppose he becomes a little less selfish as well. Finally, unsurprisingly I suppose, Gilbert overcomes his fear. I mean, there's not really much to dislike that. Maybe other than the cheesiness, but there's nothing wrong with a bit of cheese, I will actually say as well, I was quite surprised that I found the film pretty funny. I thought I'd just find it annoying. It proved me wrong in that regard, so that's great. I quite like that at the beginning of the film, the mummy is like, when they discover the mummy, he's frantically running around and they're all terrified. And then he realised he just needed the toilet, and there's a toilet right there. He's been in a coffin for 3,000 years, so it was pretty funny. Then after that, you find out that the mummy is actually not evil. He's quite nice, which is really sweet and a nice little twist on the traditional tale. I will say as well, because this film is set at Halloween, it allowed them to do some, I suppose, things that aren't that clever now, but at the time I thought probably were. So for instance, he's a mummy, it's Halloween, so he can just wander around and not cause any suspicion. But then they go one step further and he goes into a hospital, and because he's wrapped in bandages, he just kind of fits in there as well, because everyone assumes he's an injured person. That was really I thought that was quite funny. What was even funnier is when the doctors realised that he didn't have a pulse and he wasn't breathing, and they just freaked out. Again, great. Gilbert's mum is... You don't ever see her, but the way she's described is also just insane. So, his mum collects dolls, like old porcelain dolls, I'm guessing, is what's kind of implied. But that's not weird in itself, fine. Some people might find it creepy, but each to their own. But she also takes the dolls to the cinema and at one point even bought them popcorn. And she role plays with her dolls, and when she insists on being called Esmeralda. I mean, that's just too weird not to find a little bit funny. There are also just generally a lot of little jokes in this film that I kind of appreciated. Like, there's one character called Bruce, and he's like into spooky stuff and like tea leaf reading and stuff like that, and he claims that he can read varicose veins like they were tea leaves, and he did so for his mum. In general, they just kind of go insane with the mummy as well. Like, they put it in some really weird scenarios, and I'm not normally a big fan of like slapsticky stuff, but I will admit even I found it quite funny. Like, at one point they dressed the mummy to look like a 70s DJ so they can sneak it through the streets, and then the mummy ends up riding on a little pink bike with tassels on the handles. There's just something... How can you not find that a little bit funny? And there's another bit where the mummy rides on a skateboard while chasing a dog because it took his ball. I mean, I will admit, it's incredibly silly, but that's not a bad thing. I like silly humour. Finally, one thing that I often find isn't the case with a lot of these films that I've been reviewing is this one actually entertained me throughout. There wasn't really ever a point where I felt bored or like it was lulling a little bit. Now I will move on to the bad parts, the bits I just didn't really like at all. Firstly, I will say that the characters were a bit one-dimensional. Yes, they did have their distinct personalities. Yes, they did change as the film went on, but they still felt a little bit one-dimensional. However, again, as I've stressed a couple of times, we are talking about a Disney Channel movie here, so I guess that was always going to be the case. I also felt that the plot was a bit lazy, and there were parts of it that didn't really make sense. For instance, the main villain, he wants to sell the mummy so that he can pay off his debts, basically. However, when he sees the mummy is walking around, he refuses to let it back in the coffin, even though the mummy is going to turn into a pillar of salt if it doesn't get back to its coffin. So it doesn't really make sense. It's just kind of being nasty for the sake of being nasty, and in a way that's going to hurt everyone, including himself. Other than that, weirdly, there isn't that much I disliked about this film. I'm sort of shocked, actually, but I quite enjoyed it. The reviews for this film in general were quite mixed. However, as I've already stated, there are quite a few people who look really fondly upon this film and treat it as a Halloween film. Personally, I actually kind of get it. Although I'd never seen this film before, I did feel weirdly nostalgic watching it, largely because of that original Jumanji/Goosebumps kind of vibe to the film. And also, the film did genuinely make me laugh. I didn't find any of the characters particularly annoying. I mean, it's fair to say some of the jokes haven't aged well, but we are talking about a film from the 90s, and that's always going to be the case. As shocked as I am by this, I think I'm going to give this film a 7 out of 10. I actually liked it.